Juneteenth, of course, was the date that the Army showed up in Texas and in Galveston and said, okay, you guys, you're free. It was actually 2 years after the actual event, but this is when black people learned that they were free. But within a relatively short period of time, white people got about taking it back, right? The Mississippi, for example, this is under the leadership of James Z. George. He was a Democrat. This is when the Democrats were the party of, keeping black people down, and the Republicans were still sort of the Republican Party of Lincoln. George was looking for ways in a constitutional convention in Georgia to amend that state's constitution to get around the 15th Amendment. And he did it. I mean, his goal, according to the Jackson Clarier Legend, an article that was published in the 1870s, 1875, said that by expelling the electorate who could not read, the most important restrictions included poll taxes set at $2 per voter per year statewide, and with local officials permitted to charge an extra $1, and literacy tests. The election workers were empowered to evaluate a prospective voter's literacy according to an understanding clause, which said that a person must be, quote, able to read any section of the Constitution of the state or to understand the same when read to him or give a reasonable interpretation thereof. And, of course, a white person could say, well, yeah, it's the Constitution. Okay, you pass. And a black person could recite the preamble, and they would say, no, 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 no. They also added residence requirements, and they put into law that you had to register at least 4 months in advance to vote. This is when all these restrictions began. Prior to that, none of this stuff existed in American law. This happened in Georgia in 1875, and then it happened in Mississippi in 1876. The new rules were so effective that black turnout in the 1888 election in Mississippi was 40%, but by 1890, just 2 years later, that 40% black turnout in Mississippi was less than 1%. That's how effective it was. 4 years later, by 1894, 5 additional states had adopted these voter suppression laws, and the consequence of that is that the average voter turnout in most states was 73%. The average voter turnout in the South, which had been higher than that 73%, because so many black people were voting, by the election of 1894 had dropped to 42%. They were not only blocking blacks, they were also blocking poor whites. But this was particularly directed at black people. And then, of course, along came Mark Hanna. He was the very, very wealthy Cleveland industrialist who became the McKinley's kingmaker. He raised, from wealthy individuals for the election of 1880, he raised $4 million, 6% of the entire nation's GDP for McKinley's election. They outspent the opposition 5-1. It was the most expensive election in American history. And he put 1,400 paid election workers traveling around the country promoting his candidacy. He won and became president, and the Supreme Court then in 1898 handed down its decision of a challenge to Mississippi's voting restrictions. This was called Williams versus Mississippi, 1898. And it declared that those voting restrictions did not violate the 15th Amendment. So this went on. It continued in North Carolina. They followed Mississippi's example. This was in 1801. They approved the adoption of literacy tests, poll taxes. This was put into their constitution as a constitutional amendment. In the election of 1900, the red shirts groups, which included as many as 1/4 of all the whites in some counties, came out in full force to intimidate voters. One of the Democratic legislators said, Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find a Negro out, vote him, tell him to leave the polls, and if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. That election was held, and the constitutional amendment blocking black people from voting, basically putting into place poll taxes and literacy tests, passed by a 59 to 41% margin. So that was North Carolina. Thus, in 1900, there was a 75% voter turnout in North Carolina. 4 years later, in the election of 1904, after this constitutional amendment was passed in North Carolina, it dropped to 50%. And, of course, it was all white people. And as a result of this, both the Democratic and the Republican parties became more conservative. And this was the point at which Republicans completely abandoned African Americans. In Louisiana, they put into law the same thing, but they adopted a so-called grandfather clause, which exempted you from a literacy test or a property ownership test if you or your father or grandfather were eligible to vote on January 1st, 1867, when it was illegal for black people to vote all across the South. And that was the end of that. Teddy Roosevelt said he is not going to interfere. He said, quote, my chief purpose is not to effect a change in the electoral vote of the southern states. Excuse me, that was President Taft in his inaugural address in 1909. He followed Teddy Roosevelt. He said, no, we're not going to change things. And so the entire South changed itself from a functioning democracy to a region of authoritarian enclaves, writes Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman in their book, The Recurring Crises of American Democracy, Four Threats. In 1890, average turnout across the southern states was 73% voting turnout. By 1905, it was down to 42%. And by 1930, it was down to 30%. The Democrats, they write, had effectively shut down political opposition. From 1869 to 1901, every Congress except one had included African Americans, and hundreds, I'm quoting from the book here, had served in state legislatures and thousands as local officials. After 1905, after this disenfranchisement all across the South, all of them were gone. Not a single black person serving in any of those positions. Meanwhile, funding for schools collapsed and lynchings exploded. Quote, as late as 1922, one lynching took place every week, and crowds gathered to watch, treating it as a form of entertainment. Over this period of time, from basically the 1880s, when, Reconstruction collapsed right after the election of 1876. And, we've talked about this on the program before. In the election of 1876, although the Democrat, Sam Tilden, won the popular vote and won the Electoral College vote, he was one college vote short of an absolute majority. And so the election got thrown into the House of Representatives, which was controlled by it was controlled in large part at that point by the Democrats. And they were going to put Tilden in, but the Republicans threatened literally to restart the Civil War. So they came out with a strategy instead to basically stab black people in the back. This was something that was, well, thank you. This was something that was being, obviously promoted back in the day by the Democratic Party, which at that time was the racist party of the South. But the deal that they cut with the Republicans was, we'll put a Republican into the White House. We will give you Rutherford B. Hayes as president to be sworn in March of 1887, or 1877. We'll give you that. But in exchange for that, you have to withdraw all the northern troops from the southern states. All the Union troops from the southern states. In other words, end Reconstruction. And the southern states went along with this. Congress went along with this. And the result of it, as I just read to you in detail, the result of that, pretty straightforward, was that state after state starting with Georgia. Well, actually starting with Mississippi. Then it went to Georgia, then it went to Alabama. South Carolina was one of the last. North Carolina, that was 1904. That state after state after state passed laws with literacy tests, poll taxes. Literacy test was the big one. And pre-registration requirements. And in many cases, those pre-registration requirements said that you couldn't even register to vote if your father or grandfather had not been eligible to vote in 1867, on July 1st, 1867. In other words, when only white people could vote, before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. Although specifically, this is all about the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. And it's pretty amazing when you look at it, because in many ways what the Republicans are doing right now is what the Democrats were doing in the southern states in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, from this period, from roughly 1880 to around 1920. State after state after state passed these laws. This was the white response essentially to Juneteenth, the white response to the emancipation and liberation of the slaves.